Stand at the top of the Traveler's Tower on a clear Hartford morning, 27 floors above Main Street, and you can see every monument the richest city in America built for itself. The blue onion dome of the Colt Armory, the gold tower of Aetna, the 11 stories of the old G. Fox, the polychrome brick of Mark Twain's house. They are all still there. The wealth that paid for them is not. In the space of a single human lifetime, the city that rebuilt Chicago after the fire could no longer pay its own bills. This is the story of how that happened, building by building. Chapter 1. The Richest City. In America. In 1876, a journalist named Charles Hopkins Clark sat down at his desk at Scribner's Monthly and did some arithmetic that would haunt a city for a century. He took the accumulated commercial wealth of Hartford, Connecticut, and divided it by the city's modest population of roughly 40,000 people. The answer he reached was simple. Hartford, he wrote, was the richest city in the United States. The phrase traveled. It traveled into textbooks, into Sunday newspaper supplements, into the prospectuses of banks looking for investors, into the speeches of state senators looking for re-election, into the brochures of land developers looking to sell vacant lots in the West End. For the next 50 years, it followed Hartford everywhere, the richest city in America per capita. A small, clean New England capital that had somehow concentrated more money per resident than New York or Boston or Philadelphia. To understand the arithmetic, you have to understand the engines. Hartford in 1876 was running on 4 of them. The first was insurance. The Aetna, the Hartford Fire, the Connecticut Mutual, the Phoenix Mutual, and the travelers between them held more than $113 million in assets. That is a number worth saying aloud. $113 million in a town of 40,000 people. The second engine was manufacturing. Samuel Colt's Armory turned out 150,000 revolvers a year. The Cheney silk mills produced a quarter of all the silk woven in the United States. Pope made bicycles and motor cars. Pratt & Whitney made precision machine tools. Underwood made typewriters. Royal made typewriters. The third engine was finance. The Society for Savings ran one of the largest savings banks in New England. The fourth engine was culture and publishing. The Hartford Courant, founded in 1764, was already the oldest continuously published newspaper in the country. The American Publishing Company printed Mark Twain. Walk Main Street in the year Clark published his article, and you walked through a working illustration of his arithmetic. The Cheney Building, designed 3 years earlier by Henry Hobson Richardson, rose 4 stories in red brick and brownstone, occupied by a bank, a wholesale merchant, and a printer. The Allen House Hotel held 150 guest rooms. The old Brown Thompson department store carried imported goods from Paris. The Wadsworth Athenaeum, the oldest public art museum in the United States, opened its doors free of charge every weekday afternoon. The Connecticut State Capitol, then 4 years from completion, raised a gold-leaf dome above Bushnell Park. Bushnell Park itself, designed by Jacob Weidenman, was the first publicly funded park in the country. Every gas lamp on the principal streets had been paid for by the city. Every fire hydrant had been installed at city expense. Every block had a uniformed police officer walking his beat. Walk west out of the center and you reached Asylum Hill, where the insurance presidents lived in stone houses with carriage stables. Walk further and you reached Nook Farm, where Mark Twain and Harriet Beecher Stowe lived next door to each other. Walk south, across the South Meadows, and you reach the Colt complex with the blue onion dome floating above the river Fog. Walk north and you reach the Connecticut River, where the steamboats from Long Island Sound docked at the city pier. There was no slum visible from any of these walks. The slums existed. They sat below Front Street on the east side, where Italian immigrants kept their boarding houses and their fruit carts. Charles Clark mentioned them in passing in his article and called them, in the language of his day, a slum of the first magnitude. But they were tucked behind the Allen House on streets the insurance presidents did not use. The Hartford Clark described was the Hartford its richest residents wished to be seen by the rest of the country. The trouble with the arithmetic was that it relied on the wealth staying where it had been made. Every engine that drove Hartford depended on a particular set of conditions that would, in time, change. The insurance companies depended on a national geography in which a small New England office could control an agent network across half a continent. The manufacturing depended on a labor force that lived within walking distance of the works. The publishing depended on a slower national appetite for books. The finance depended on a banking system that had not yet centralized on New York. In 1876, none of those conditions were in doubt. Hartford was the richest city in America, and the buildings that proved it were already going up. Walk that same main street today, and the buildings are mostly still there. The wealth that paid for them is not. The question this video tries to answer is what could possibly destroy such a perfectly engineered prosperity, and how the destruction happened so quietly that the buildings outlived it. Chapter 2. Samuel Colt builds a Russian dome. Samuel Colt came home from Russia in 1854 with an idea that would give Hartford the strangest skyline in America. He had been received at the court of Tsar Nicholas I in St. Petersburg, demonstrating his revolvers to a sovereign who already owned several pairs and wanted more. He stayed long enough to see the city. He walked under the onion domes of the cathedrals. He came back to Hartford in the spring of 1855 with the silhouette already in his head. He found his architect ready. Octavius Jordan was a young English-born draftsman working in Hartford on commercial commissions. Colt asked him to sketch an armory with a Russian dome on top. Jordan drew the dome. Colt approved it. Construction began that summer. The building rose on the south meadows of Hartford, on land Colt had bought up over the previous 5 years for roughly $250,000. The site had been swamp and seasonal floodplain. Colt drained it, raised the level with fill, built a dike to keep the Connecticut River out, and put down a hard-rolled gravel base for his factory. The East Armory, the centerpiece of the complex, rose 3 stories in red brick laid in long, flat courses, with arched windows that ran almost floor to ceiling. The dome sat on top, on a colonnade of slender white pillars, painted a deep azure blue, studded with gold 5-pointed stars, and topped by a rampant gilded colt mounted on a sphere. The dome was Colt's signature. From a mile away on the river, it told you whose factory you were looking at. The blue was unmistakable. Hartford had never seen a color like that on any of its buildings. Most of the city's architecture before the armory was painted white, or left as natural brick, or finished in the soft brown of Connecticut sandstone. Colt's dome was a piece of St. Petersburg planted on the Connecticut River, and it became the city's lighthouse. The factory inside the building was as advanced as the silhouette above it. Colt had been refining the American system of manufactures for 15 years. Ever since his first attempt at a factory in Paterson, New Jersey in the 1830s had failed. He had learned to mill components to fixed dimensions so that each part of a revolver was interchangeable with the same part from any other revolver of the same model. He had learned to set up his machines on a single steam shaft so that one engine drove the entire factory. He had learned to organize his workers by station rather than by skill, so that each man worked one specific operation on one specific machine for a full day. The Colt Armory in 1855 was the most advanced precision manufacturing facility in the world. Inside the long arched halls, leather belts ran from a central steam shaft and turned the milling machines, the rifling lathes, and the drop hammers on each floor. The armory employed about 1,000 workers at the start. Wages ranged from $2.75 to $3.25 a day for the machinists. The skilled men earned more than the average Hartford clerk. They lived in brick row houses Colt built around the armory in a planned village he called Coltsville. They walked half a mile to work along brick-paved alleys. They worshipped at a church Colt's widow would later build for them, the Church of the Good Shepherd, designed in the style of an English country parish church. The man behind the dome did not live to see the village finished. Samuel Colt was 47 when he died. He had been suffering from rheumatism and what his contemporaries called gout for years. And on the night of the 10th of January, 1862, he stopped breathing. His estate at his death was estimated at $15 million, an immense sum that would be roughly $450 million in today's money. He left behind a widow of 35, Elizabeth Hart Jarvis Colt, who was pregnant with their 5th child, and a half-built armory complex that he had been expanding all year. Elizabeth Colt did not retreat. She took up the running of the firm with the help of her brother-in-law, Richard Jarvis, and continued the construction Samuel had begun. She bought adjacent land, she expanded the willow furniture works that absorbed surplus labor in slack revolver months. She pushed the building of the dike along the river. and she signed off on the worker housing that filled out Coltsville. By the time the Civil War ended in 1865, the armory was producing rifles and revolvers to the Union Army at a rate of more than 30,000 a year. Elizabeth Colt had become one of the wealthiest women in the United States and one of the most experienced industrial managers in New England. The Russian dome above the armory was already a symbol of her city. It would stand for 2 more years before it fell. The fall, when it came, was a turning point not just for the Colt family, but for the entire idea of Hartford as a city that could survive disaster. What happened to the dome on the morning of February the 4th, 1864, is one of the stories the city has retold to itself ever since, and the rebuilding of the dome by Elizabeth Colt is one of the clearest pieces of evidence we have of what kind of woman she had become. Chapter 3. Mark Twain, Names. The Gilded Age. A river pilot from Missouri moved to Hartford in 1871 and built the most peculiar mansion in New England across town from the men who paid for it. Samuel Langhorne Clemens, writing as Mark Twain, had chosen the city for 3 reasons. The American Publishing Company was there, and they printed his books on subscription. His wife Olivia's family had connections to the small intellectual circle at Nook Farm on the west side. And Hartford itself, the city Clark had named the richest in America 5 years earlier, was the kind of place a writer with sudden money could become a respectable citizen overnight. Twain bought a building lot at the corner of Farmington Avenue and Forest Street and engaged a New York architect named Edward Tuckerman Potter to design the house. What Potter drew was unlike anything else in Hartford. It was a 19-room high Victorian Gothic mansion, finished in alternating courses of orange and black brick, laid in geometric patterns that made the walls look striped. The roof carried 5 turrets at different heights, and a long covered balcony along the south face. A porte cochere ran out the east side for the carriage drop. Inside, the main entrance hall was paneled in carved oak and stenciled in deep colors. The house was, in the words of Twain's biographer Justin Kaplan, part steamboat, part medieval fortress, and part cuckoo clock. It cost roughly $40,000 to $45,000 to build in 1873 and 74. In today's money, that is around $5 million. Twain did not have that kind of money when he started the house. He borrowed against the proceeds of The Innocents Abroad, his first major commercial success, and against the future earnings of books he had not yet written. He moved in with Olivia and their first daughter Susie in 1874 and stayed until 1891. In that house, Twain wrote almost everything most readers think of when they think of Mark Twain. He wrote The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. He wrote The Prince and the Pauper. He wrote Life on the Mississippi. He wrote Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. He wrote A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. He wrote almost all of these in a 3rd-floor billiard room that he had set up as his study, with a long desk under a window looking south across the Park River Valley. He worked in cigar smoke. He paced when stuck. He shouted draft lines at his daughters when they came in. The community around him was the densest concentration of literary and intellectual talent in any American small city of the period. Harriet Beecher Stowe lived next door. Charles Dudley Warner, the editor of the Hartford Courant, lived a few houses down. Isabella Beecher Hooker, Stowe's half-sister and a leading suffragist, lived across the way. The Reverend Joseph Twitchell, Twain's closest friend, and his pastor at the Asylum Hill Congregational Church, lived nearby. The 4 households visited each other almost daily. The most consequential piece of writing Twain produced in that house was not one of his novels. It was a satirical book called The Gilded Age, co-written with Charles Dudley Warner and published in 1873. The book was a sour comic exposure of the speculation, corruption, and self-deception of post-war American business and politics. Its title was Twain's Coinage. The Gilded Age in his telling was an age that looked like gold on the surface and was something baser beneath. The phrase has shaped American historical memory ever since. Every textbook account of the period between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century uses Twain's name for it. What is striking is where Twain wrote the phrase. He wrote it in Hartford, in the richest city in America, in a polychrome brick mansion built with money borrowed against a comic travel book. The man who named the Gilded Age was living inside its single most ostentatious small example. He knew it. He understood the irony. He stayed anyway for 17 years because the company was good and the work was good, and the city around him was, for that brief period, the best small city in the country to live in. In the basement of the house, Twain installed one of the first burglar alarms in the United States, a primitive wired system that connected each ground floor window to a bell in the butler's pantry. Above ground, he installed one of the first telephone lines in a private American residence, run from the house to the office of his publisher downtown. In 1881, he commissioned the firm of Louis Comfort Tiffany, then trading as Associated Artists, to redecorate the principal rooms. Tiffany's wallpapers, his stenciled silver leaf patterns, and his stained glass survive in the entry hall, the drawing room, the library, and the dining room. The house holds one of the only complete Tiffany interior schemes still in place anywhere in the world. It was, in other words, a working illustration of Charles Clark's arithmetic. Every dollar in that house came directly or indirectly from the wealth Clark had measured. The books that paid for it were printed by the American Publishing Company, which depended on the city's printing trade. The insurance on it was carried by the Hartford. The telephone line was installed by the Southern New England Telephone Company, then a Hartford-based firm. The carved oak paneling was made by craftsmen in Hartford workshops. The Tiffany glass was hung by men sent up from New York, but installed on Hartford labor. Twain stayed in the house until the spring of 1891. By then, his investments had gone wrong. He had spent more than $190,000 on the Page typesetter, a complex automatic typesetting machine that never worked reliably and was rendered obsolete by the linotype almost as soon as it was finished. He owed his publisher. He owed his bank. He closed the house, dismissed most of his servants, and took his family to Europe to live more cheaply. He kept the house. He could not afford to staff it. He told friends he meant to come back as soon as his books had earned him out of his debts. He never did. His daughter Susie died of meningitis during a brief visit to the house in the August of 1896, and after that, Twain and Olivia could not bear to live in it again. The most peculiar mansion in New England sat empty. What Twain had named was an age. What Hartford did not yet know was that the age he had named was already beginning its long, slow ending. Chapter 4. Hartford Pays for Chicago. To Rebuild. On the night of October the 8th, 1871, a Chicago barn caught fire, and a Hartford insurance industry became a global one. The fire ran through dry timber houses for 2.5 days and burned roughly 3 1/3 square miles of the city. It killed about 300 people. It left 90,000 homeless. It destroyed 17,500 buildings. The total insured loss in 1871 dollars was roughly $200 million. Across the country, 193 insurance companies were on the hook for some share of that loss. Most of them could not pay. 68 failed outright in the weeks after the fire. Another 65 paid only partial claims. The whole American property insurance industry was, for a moment, in question. Whether a fire policy was worth anything at all depended on whether the company you had bought it from could find the cash. The Hartford could find the cash. The Hartford Fire Insurance Company had been chartered in 1810 and had spent the next 60 years building a portfolio of policies across the eastern half of the country. Its executives, sitting at desks in the company's headquarters on Trumbull Street, calculated their Chicago exposure in the first hours after the fire and concluded that they could pay every claim in full. They wired the announcement to their agents in Chicago and to the newspapers. The Hartford would pay. Aetna, sitting 2 blocks away, made the same calculation and the same announcement. Connecticut Mutual paid. Phoenix Mutual paid. The Travelers, which carried less Chicago property exposure but had begun to write accident policies on travelers caught in the fire, paid those too. In the months after October 1871, Hartford money rebuilt central Chicago. The brick walls of the Loop, the new office buildings that would soon make Chicago the birthplace of the American skyscraper, were paid for in significant part by checks written out of the Hartford insurance treasuries. Chicago understood this. Chicago newspapers in the rebuilding years used the phrase Hartford money in their pages as a shorthand for honest insurance. The fire of November the 9th, 1872, in central Boston, did the same thing. Another 60 acres of dense commercial property burned. Another $76 million of insured loss. The Hartford and Aetna paid every claim. So did Phoenix Mutual. The pattern was set. When catastrophe destroyed wealth elsewhere in the country, Hartford absorbed the loss, paid the claims, and rebuilt its own reserves over the following 2 or 3 years by writing new policies at slightly higher premiums. The mechanism was as elegant as a piece of clockwork. Disaster elsewhere made Hartford richer. The most extreme test came on the morning of April the 18th, 1906. The San Francisco earthquake of that day, followed by 3 days of fire that consumed roughly 28,000 buildings, killed at least 3,000 people, and left more than 250,000 homeless. The insured loss was estimated at around $235 million. Of that total, Aetna alone paid roughly $4.5 million. The Hartford paid more than $1,800,000. Phoenix Mutual paid roughly $1 million. Connecticut Mutual paid about $800,000. The combined Hartford payout was close to $10 million, of which not a single penny was contested. By contrast, 12 insurance companies based elsewhere in the country failed completely in the weeks after the San Francisco fire. Another 20 offered policyholders 10 cents on the dollar or less. The Hartford companies paid in full and gained in San Francisco the kind of brand reputation that would carry them through the next 30 years. By 1890, the city's 6 largest insurance firms together carried capital reserves estimated at more than $200 million. By 1900, the figure had climbed past $300 million. By 1920, it was past $500 million. The Hartford insurance industry had become, in less than a century, the largest single concentration of property and casualty capital in the United States outside New York City. That capital paid for the buildings that began to rise downtown. It paid for Travelers Tower in 1919, the 7th tallest building in the world the day it opened, the first commercial building outside New York to rise above 500 feet, the tallest building in New England for the next 45 years. Don Barber, the architect, set the limestone tower up on a classical base, raised a long, unornamented shaft, and crowned it with a Boar's cap, so elaborate it carried a small, open observation gallery at the 27th floor level. The tower cost roughly $5.5 million to build. Travelers paid in cash from its reserves. The capital paid for the Hartford Fire Insurance Company's own building. It paid for the Connecticut Mutual building. It paid for the Phoenix Mutual building. It paid for the Hartford Steam Boiler Inspection and Insurance Company offices. By the 1920s, the Central Business District of Hartford was the most expensively built per square foot of any small city in the United States. It also paid the salaries. A senior insurance clerk in the 1890s earned between $1,200 and $1,800 a year. The president of the Hartford Fire Insurance Company in the same period drew $20,000 a year. By the 1920s, an Aetna underwriter earned $3,000 and an Aetna vice president $50,000. The combined insurance payroll in the city in 1920 exceeded $15 million a year, almost all of which was spent at Hartford grocers, tailors, restaurants, theaters, and house builders. What the Hartford insurance industry had done, in effect, was build a self-contained economy in which catastrophes in California, Illinois, and Massachusetts paid for the gold leaf on a state capitol dome in Connecticut. It was a small, elegant, almost miraculous machine. It would run, with minor adjustments, for almost 100 years. When it stopped running, it would stop quietly enough that most of the people inside the buildings would not notice for a long time. Chapter 5. Beatrice Fox Builds the Largest Store. A 37-year-old widow walked into her father's burned-out store in 1917 and rebuilt it into the largest privately owned retail building in the United States. The store was G. Fox & Company. It stood on the corner of Main Street and Talcott Street, on the eastern side of downtown Hartford, where it had been operating since 1847. The Fox family had come to Hartford from Germany in the 1840s. 2 brothers, Gerson and Isaac Fox, opened a single-room, dry goods store on Main Street in 1847. Isaac sold his interest to his brother within a few years, and Gerson renamed the firm G. Fox & Company. Gerson's son Moses joined the business in 1863 and took it over in 1880 when his father died. By the early 20th century, G. Fox had grown to 5 floors of merchandise and was the largest department store between New York and Boston. On the morning of January the 4th, 1917, the building caught fire. The The cause was never definitively established. The blaze ran through 5 floors of dry goods, paper, and wooden display cases in less than 4 hours. By noon, the store was a smoking shell. Moses Fox, then in his early 70s, walked the wreckage with a city inspector that afternoon. By the end of the day, he had announced that he would rebuild on the same lot and that the new building would be larger than the one that had burned. What he built was 11 stories high, occupied most of the block, and was designed by Cass Gilbert, the New York architect who had 4 years earlier finished the Woolworth building on Lower Broadway. Gilbert designed the new G. Fox in cream-colored terracotta with vast plate glass display windows on the lower floors. A central atrium ran up through the building, flooding the principal sales floors with natural light. 8 passenger elevators and 4 freight elevators served the upper floors. The interior carried more than 700,000 square feet of retail and warehouse space. It opened in 1918. The fire that destroyed the old store had another consequence. It brought Beatrice Fox Auerbach back to Hartford. Beatrice was Moses Fox's daughter. She had been born in 1887 and had married George Auerbach of Salt Lake City in 1911. She had been living in Utah, raising 2 daughters when the fire reached her by telegram. She and her husband came east at once to help her father with the rebuilding. She was, at that moment, intelligent, energetic, and entirely untrained in retail. Within 20 years, she would be one of the most powerful women in American business. George Auerbach died in 1927. Beatrice was 40 years old, with 2 teenage daughters, and she never remarried. She moved into a senior managerial role at the store under her father's direction. When Moses Fox died in 1938, Beatrice took control of the company. She would run it for the next 27 years. What she built was unlike anything else in American retail. She set the store up as a working laboratory of what she called employee welfare. The building contained, by the late 1940s, an in-house hospital with a doctor and 3 nurses on duty during opening hours. It contained an employee cafeteria serving subsidized meals. It contained an in-house beauty parlor. It contained a credit union for employees. It contained a retirement plan with company contributions, decades before such plans were common in American retail. It contained paid vacations for full-time staff. It contained interest-free loans for employees in hardship. It contained an in-house tailor for staff uniforms. The store also integrated its workforce. In the early 1940s, Beatrice Auerbach hired black sales staff onto the main shopping floors. She paid them the same wages as her white sales staff. She promoted them on the same schedules. She seated them in the same cafeteria. None of this was required by federal law. None of this was common practice in any northern department store at the time. Most American retailers in the 1940s either refused to hire black staff at all or hired them only as porters, cleaners, and elevator operators. Beatrice Auerbach refused to run her store that way. In 1957, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People made her a lifetime member in recognition of her integrated hiring practices. The store grew. By the 1940s, G. Fox was serving more than 50,000 customers a week. The Connecticut Room, the restaurant on the 11th floor, served roughly 5,000 meals a day. The store ran 12 delivery trucks and operated 2 warehouses across the city. The annual revenue passed $30 million by the end of the 1940s and reached $85 million by the middle of the 1950s. G. Fox was, in those years, the largest privately owned department store in the United States. The store became a kind of social institution in Hartford. The mothers of the city took their daughters to G. Fox for their first communion dresses, their high school graduation dresses, their wedding trousseaux. The fathers of the city took their sons there for their first suit. The Christmas displays in the Main Street windows drew crowds from across Connecticut every December. The store's children's department employed a full-time Santa Claus through the holiday season and held tea parties for daughters of customers. The basement food hall sold imported delicacies that ordinary Hartford grocers did not stock. Beatrice Auerbach herself ran the store from a small paneled office on the upper floors. She arrived at her desk at 8 in the morning and left at 6 in the evening. She walked the sales floors twice a day. She knew her department managers by name. She did not give interviews. She did not appear in newspaper society pages. She refused to be photographed unless the photograph was necessary for a business purpose. She was, by reputation, the the most discreet major retail executive in the country. In 1965, she sold the company. She was 78 years old. She had run G. Fox for 27 years. She had outlived her father, her husband, and most of the men who had served as her senior managers when she first took over. She sold to the May department stores company for cash. Asked at the time what she would do with the proceeds, she said that she would not be spending the money on yachts and horses, but on the benefit of the people. She gave most of it away. She funded scholarships at Hartford colleges. She funded the Beatrice Fox Auerbach Foundation, which still operates today. She bought a major piece of land in West Hartford and donated it to the city as a park. She died in 1968 at the age of 81. She is buried at Beth Israel Cemetery in Hartford. The store carried on under May ownership for another 28 years. May converted it to the Fellines brand in 1993 and closed the Hartford location for good, not long after. The 11-story building stood largely empty through the 1990s. In 2002, the state of Connecticut bought it and converted the upper floors to office space for Capital Community College. The retail floors were never reopened. Walk Main Street today, and the building still stands. The cream terracotta facade is still there. The plate glass display windows on the lower floors are still there. The central atrium is still there. The largest privately owned department store in America is, on the inside, a working community college. The most discreet major retail executive in American history is, on the outside, almost invisible. Almost. If you stop at the corner of Main Street and Talcott Street and look up, the building she rebuilt with her father, after a fire she did not see coming, still holds the corner of Hartford the way she left it. Is in Chapter 6. Aetna builds a colonial fortress. In the deepest year of the Great Depression, a Hartford insurance company spent $9.5 million on a colonial revival building large enough to swallow a small town. The company was Aetna. The year was 1931. The country was contracting by every measure. Industrial production had fallen by more than 30% since 1929. Unemployment had passed 16%. Half of the country's banks had failed or were in the process of failing. Most large American businesses were halting new construction altogether and laying off staff. The Aetna was building. The site was a 15-acre plot on Farmington Avenue at the western edge of the city's central business district. The architect was James Gamble Rogers, then best known for his work at Yale. The building he produced was the largest colonial revival office building ever attempted anywhere in the world. It rose 7 stories and covered nearly 250,000 square feet of internal floor space. It was faced in red brick with white stone trim. It carried a central tower modeled directly on the old State House at the foot of Main Street, which Charles Bulfinch had designed in 1796. The tower was the building's signature. It carried a gilded dome, a copper weathercock, an open belfry, and a clock that struck the hours over the western half of Hartford. The dome could be seen from a mile away on Farmington Avenue and from the residential streets of Asylum Hill. It told you at a glance where the center of the city's insurance wealth had relocated. The Aetna decision to build during the worst year of the Depression was deliberate. The company had reviewed its policy reserves, its claim exposures, and its long-term projections, and had concluded that it could afford to build. It had also calculated that construction costs were lower than they had been in 15 years, that skilled labor was abundant, that materials could be purchased at a discount, and that the building would stand as a public statement of confidence at a moment when public confidence was scarce. The board approved the project in 1929. Ground was broken in 1930. The building was occupied in 1931. The interior was as elaborate as the exterior. The main lobby was finished in marble, walnut paneling, and brass. The long axial corridors carried coffered plaster ceilings and oak doors. The boardroom on the top floor carried an oil portrait of every Aetna president since the company's founding in 1819. The library held more than 10,000 bound volumes of insurance industry records and actuarial tables. 6 elevators served the 7 floors. The building was designed as a self-contained office city. The lower basement carried a complete post office, operating under a federal contract. It carried a print shop large enough to produce the company's policies, brochures, and internal forms. It carried a cafeteria capable of serving 1,200 meals a day. It carried a barber shop. It carried an infirmary with 2 staff doctors and 4 nurses. It carried a tailor. It carried a small bank branch. An office worker arriving at the Aetna in the morning could, in principle, spend his entire working day in the building without going outside. The workforce that filled it was, by the standards of the 1930s, enormous. By 1935, the Aetna employed more than 3,000 people in the Farmington Avenue building. By 1950, the figure had passed 5,000. By 1970, it had reached 8,000. The building was the single largest concentration of insurance employment in the United States outside the New York headquarters of a few competitors. The hidden infrastructure of the building was as detailed as the visible architecture. The office workers entered through the marble lobby on Farmington Avenue and rode the oak-paneled elevators to their floors. The service workers, including the cleaners, the kitchen staff, the porters, the boiler operators, and the delivery men, used a separate service entrance on the rear elevation and a separate set of stairs. The cleaners worked overnight shifts, beginning at 6 in the evening and finishing at 2 in the morning. The boiler operators worked rotating shifts 24 hours a day. The kitchen staff began work at 4 in the morning to prepare the cafeteria's breakfast service. None of these workers were seen by the insurance clerks who filled the building during the day. The Aetna paid its junior clerks roughly $1,200 a year in the 1930s. It paid its senior underwriters between $4,000 and $6,000. It paid its actuaries between $5,000 and $10,000. It paid its vice presidents between $15,000 and $35,000. It paid its president, Henry Boughton Beach, $60,000 a year through the worst of the Depression. The combined Aetna payroll in 1935 was more than $8 million a year, almost all of which was spent at Hartford stores, restaurants, and house builders. The building Aetna had built was, in effect, the second great architectural statement of the Hartford insurance industry. The first had been the Travelers Tower of 1919, a vertical exclamation point above Main Street. The second was the Aetna building of 1931, a horizontal fortress on Farmington Avenue. Between them, they framed downtown Hartford from east to west. They were both the work of insurance companies that expected to be in Hartford forever. The other insurance companies followed. The Connecticut Mutual Life Insurance Company built a new headquarters at Pearl and Garden Streets in 1926. The Phoenix Mutual Life Insurance Company built a new headquarters on Constitution Plaza in 1963, the year after the Constitution Plaza development opened, in a building shaped like a boat hull. The Hartford Fire Insurance Company built a tower at the corner of Asylum Street and Cogswell Avenue in 1921 and expanded it across multiple sites over the following 60 years. By the middle of the 20th century, the insurance industry occupied roughly 70% of the office space inside the city limits. There was, however, a quiet shift beginning. In 1957, the Connecticut General Life Insurance Company moved out of downtown Hartford altogether. It built a new modernist campus in suburban Bloomfield, designed by Gordon Bunshaft of the New York firm Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. The campus carried a low-slung curtain-walled office building on a landscaped site with employee parking, an employee cafeteria, an employee health center, and recreational fields. The company explained the move as a matter of operational convenience. Its employees could drive to work and park free. It would not have to compete for downtown office space. It could expand on the same site as it grew, other insurance executives noticed. The Connecticut General campus was attractive, modern, and cheap. It set the precedent that within 30 years would empty the downtown insurance towers one by one. In 1957, nobody at the Aetna or the Hartford or the Travelers was prepared to follow Connecticut General. The buildings on Farmington Avenue and Main Street were too vast, too well built, too expensive to abandon. The companies were committed to the city. They expected to be in the city forever. They were wrong. The cracks were already in place. The interstate highways were being planned. The federal mortgage programs were already moving white middle-class workers to the suburbs. The shareholder activist movement that would, 30 years later, push major insurance companies to merge or to relocate was already gathering its first members at New York investment houses. The Aetna building of 1931, the largest colonial-style building in the world, the deepest depression statement of confidence by any American insurance company, was the high watermark of a city that had not yet noticed the tide was already going out. Chapter 7. The Colt Armory. Goes quiet. On a winter morning. In 1994, the last machinist at the Colt Armory shut his lathe and walked out under the blue dome for the final time. The factory had been operating on the South Meadows of Hartford for 139 years. Samuel Colt had laid the first brick in 1854. Elizabeth Colt had rebuilt the Blue Dome after the fire of 1864. Through the Civil War, through the 1880 boom, through the First World War, through the Second World War, through the long post-war peace, the Armory had turned out revolvers, rifles, and machine guns to American soldiers, police forces, and civilian markets. On that winter morning in 1994, the operation stopped. The story of how the Armory went quiet is the story of how American manufacturing left New England. It is not a story of dramatic collapse. It is a story of slow attrition over a century. The Colt family sold the firm in 1901. Caldwell Hart Colt, Elizabeth's only surviving son, had died in 1894 at the age of 35, leaving no children. Elizabeth herself was almost 70 at the turn of the century, and had no other heir interested in running the company. A syndicate of Boston and New York investors, led by the Hartford banker Charles G. Marble, bought the firm in 1901 for roughly $2 million. The new owners kept the Colt name, kept the South Meadows site, and kept the existing senior managers. The company continued to make revolvers under the same brand, but the local family control was finished. Under absentee ownership, the company expanded into new product lines. During the First World War, the Armory was retooled for the Browning automatic rifle and the Browning machine gun. It produced more than 100,000 weapons for the American Expeditionary Forces. The workforce grew to more than 10,000 at the wartime peak. New buildings were added on the South Meadows site. New worker housing was built in Coltsville. The Blue Dome became a symbol of the wartime American arsenal as much as of the original Colt revolver. After the war, the company contracted. By the late 1920s, the workforce was back down to about 3,000. The Second World War brought another expansion. The company made M1911 pistols, M3 grease guns, and various rifles for the United States Army. The workforce reached 15,000 at the wartime peak in 1943. After Victory in Europe Day and victory over Japan Day, the company contracted again, and by the early 1950s, the workforce was below 5,000. The pattern was set. War boom, peacetime contraction, war boom, peacetime contraction. Through the Korean War and the Vietnam War, the cycle continued, but each peacetime trough was lower than the last. The civilian market for Colt revolvers and rifles was shrinking against competition from Smith & Wesson, Ruger, Remington, and a growing number of foreign manufacturers. The military market was increasingly being awarded to other firms. By the 1970s, the Colt operation on the South Meadows employed about 2,000 people. The corporate ownership of the firm changed several times. In 1955, Colt was bought by the Penn Texas Corporation, a Texas-based industrial conglomerate. In 1964, Penn Texas was renamed Fairbanks Whitney. In 1964, it was renamed again to Colt Industries. In 1990, the company was taken private in a leveraged buyout backed by Boston investors. Each ownership change was accompanied by promises that the South Meadows operation would continue. Each was followed by further consolidation. The labor relationship soured. A long, bitter strike at the South Meadows, works between 1986 and 1990, divided the workforce, alienated the community, and persuaded the company's owners that the Hartford site was not viable. In 1994, the Colt Manufacturing Company filed for bankruptcy protection. As part of the restructuring, the South Meadows manufacturing operation was closed. A small headquarters operation remained in West Hartford. The actual production of Colt firearms moved out of Hartford altogether. The building stood empty. The Blue Dome still rose above the South Meadows. The East Armory still ran its long arched windows along Wethersfield Avenue. The Willow Furniture Works still stood at the back of the complex. The Church of the Good Shepherd, built by Elizabeth Colt, still rose at the edge of the site. The worker housing of Coltsville still lined the streets behind the Armory. The only thing missing was workers. For more than a decade, the complex sat. The Blue Dome, which had been replaced in the early 1970s, with a fiberglass replica because the original wooden structure had rotted out, weathered through Hartford winters. The brick walls of the East Armory absorbed graffiti. The windows, boarded against vandals, took on a dull gray color. From Interstate 91, drivers passing the South Meadows could still see the blue dome, but the buildings around it looked, in the long phrase of a Hartford planning report from the late 1990s, like an architectural monument waiting for a use. The eventual use came slowly. A consortium of developers, working with the city, the state, and the National Park Service, began a long restoration project in the mid-2000s. The East Armory was converted to residential lofts under the Coltsville development. The Church of the Good Shepherd was preserved as a working parish church. The worker housing was renovated for new residents. The Willow Furniture Works was converted to office space. In 2008, the complex was designated a National Historic Landmark District by the federal government. In 2014, Congress authorized the establishment of Coltsville National Historical Park, a unit of the National Park Service centered on the East Armory. The blue dome was restored, the fiberglass replica was repaired, the blue paint was refreshed, the gold stars were repainted, and the rampant Colt on the sphere at the top was re-gilded. The dome that Octavius Jordan had drawn for Samuel Colt in 1855, that had collapsed in a fire and been rebuilt by Elizabeth Colt in 1867, that had presided over the wartime expansion of the armory through 2 world wars, that had watched the last machinist walk out in 1994, still stands over the South Meadows of Hartford. It is the city's most recognizable silhouette. It is a national historic landmark. It is, in the deepest sense, a monument to a kind of American industrial confidence that no longer exists. What it is not is a working armory. The factory inside the dome is gone. The men who walk the brick, paved alleys from Coltsville to the works every morning are gone. The machine tools, the rifling lathes, the drop hammers are gone. The dome and the buildings below it have outlasted by some margin the activity they were built to contain. They will probably outlast Hartford itself. Chapter 8. Hartford demolishes its own neighborhood. Between 1960 and 1963, the city of Hartford demolished a tightly knit Italian neighborhood of 187 families to build a raised concrete plaza that emptied at 6 in the evening. The neighborhood was called Front Street. The plaza was called Constitution Plaza. The decision was, by every measure the city used at the time, a model of progressive urban planning. By every measure it has been judged by since, it was one of the most damaging civic mistakes of the 20th century. Front Street ran from State Street down to the Connecticut River, parallel to Main Street on its east side. It had been settled in the 19th century by Irish, then German, then Italian immigrants, and by the 1930s was the heart of Hartford's Little Italy. It carried in 3 blocks more than 30 Italian restaurants, several Italian grocers, half a dozen barber shops, 2 churches, a number of social clubs, a pasta factory, a wholesale fruit merchant, a small theater, several apartment buildings, and a thick web of family-run businesses. The streets were narrow, the buildings were close. The Italian was spoken alongside English. The neighborhood was, by every standard of post-war urban sociology, a working ethnic enclave of the kind New York had on Mulberry Street and Boston had on Hanover Street. The Front Street neighborhood had suffered, like much of East Side Hartford, in the floods of 1936 and 1938, when the Connecticut River had topped its banks and swept through the lower floors of the closest buildings. The flood damage had never been fully repaired. Through the 1940s and 50s, parts of Front Street looked tired. The brick was unrepointed. The wooden cornices had begun to rot. The sidewalks had cracked. To a city planner of the 1950s, trained in the language of slum clearance and federal urban renewal, the neighborhood was a problem. In 1954, the Federal Housing Act provided cities with matching funds for the demolition and redevelopment of areas designated as blighted. Hartford's city government, led by Mayor James Kinsella, applied for the funds and designated the Front Street neighborhood as the priority target. The Hartford Redevelopment Agency, working with a consortium of insurance company executives, drew up a plan. The plan called for the demolition of a 12-acre area, the relocation of the residents and businesses to other parts of the city, and the construction on the cleared land of a 6-building, 3-block office and hotel development raised on a concrete plinth above street level. The plinth would carry, on its upper surface, a 3 4/5 acre rooftop garden called Constitution Plaza. The project was approved in 1957, Demolition began in 1960. By the end of 1963, every building on Front Street had been leveled. 187 families were displaced. 108 businesses were displaced. The relocated families were offered, under the federal rules, a small relocation payment and assistance in finding new housing. The relocated businesses were offered a similar payment and assistance in finding new commercial space. In practice, most of the businesses did not survive the move. The pasta factory closed. The wholesale fruit merchant moved to the suburbs. The Italian restaurants scattered. The 2 churches closed. What was built on the cleared land cost $42 million and opened in stages between 1961 and 1964. The development included the Hartford National Bank building, the Travelers Company's subsidiary Phoenix Mutual Life Insurance Company headquarters in the shape of a boat hull designed by Max Abramovitz, the Hartford Insurance Group offices, a hotel called the Hotel Sonesta, a parking garage, and the Central Plaza itself. The plaza was raised 1 story above street level. It carried fountains, planters, sculptures, and stone benches. It was reached by escalators and broad steps from the surrounding sidewalks. The plaza failed almost immediately. It was, on a cold January afternoon, an empty windswept platform of concrete. It was, on a hot July afternoon, an empty sun-baked platform of concrete. There were no shops. There were no restaurants on the plaza level. There was nothing to draw anyone who was not working in one of the surrounding office buildings. After 6 in the evening, when the office workers went home, the plaza was deserted. After 10 in the evening, it was a dangerous place to be alone. The dense web of Italian street life that Front Street had carried had been replaced by a piece of corporate landscape architecture that nobody used. The other consequence was even more damaging. The Front Street neighborhood had connected downtown Hartford to the Connecticut River. The old streets had run in a continuous urban fabric from the center of the city down to the water. Constitution Plaza, raised on its concrete plinth, broke that connection. The river became something downtown workers saw from their office windows rather than something they could walk to. The waterfront was abandoned. Constitution Plaza was the first and largest of Hartford's urban renewal projects. It was not the only one. Through the 1960s and 70s, the city demolished other neighborhoods to make way for new office buildings, parking garages, and elevated highway interchanges. Interstate 84 was driven through the center of the city in 1965 on an elevated viaduct that cut Asylum Hill off from the central business district. Interstate 91 was driven up the eastern edge of the city in 1967 on a viaduct that cut the South Meadows off from downtown. The 2 highways made the city easier to drive into and almost impossible to walk across. The white middle class, which had been moving to the suburbs since the late 1940s, accelerated its departure. Between 1950 and 1970, the population of Hartford fell from 177,000 to 160,000, while the population of West Hartford rose from 44,000 to 68,000, and the population of Wethersfield rose from 12,000 to 27,000. The city was losing the residents who paid its property taxes and gaining residents who needed its services. The mathematics of Hartford's municipal finances began to slide. By the middle 1970s, the consequences of the demolition were visible from any window in any insurance tower downtown. Constitution Plaza was a quiet expanse of gray concrete. Front Street was gone. The river was unreachable. The old fabric of streets and small businesses was replaced by parking lots and freeway ramps. The neighborhoods that remained, mostly on the north end and the south end of the city, were increasingly black and Puerto Rican, increasingly poor, and increasingly cut off from the downtown by the elevated highways. The city government of the 1960s had believed, with a kind of perfect confidence, that demolishing old neighborhoods and replacing them with modern buildings would restore the downtown tax base. The opposite happened. The neighborhoods that had been demolished had been small, but had paid property taxes. The new buildings were larger, but generated less revenue, because many of their tenants negotiated long-term tax abatements as a condition of their move into the new construction. By the late 1970s, Hartford was generating less tax revenue per acre of downtown land than it had been before the demolitions began. The error was understood, in retrospect, almost immediately. By the 1980s, the planning literature had turned against urban renewal and against elevated highways and against raised concrete plazas. By the 1990s, Hartford's own planning consultants were recommending the demolition of the highway viaducts and the gradual restoration of the street grid. By the 2010s, the city had begun, very slowly, to rebuild Front Street as a mixed-use entertainment and residential development on the block immediately east of Constitution Plaza. The rebuilt Front Street is, by every measure, a better place than the empty plaza it replaced. It is also, by every measure, smaller, less dense, and less authentically Italian-American than the neighborhood that was demolished 60 years ago. The Italian families who had lived on the original Front Street are mostly gone from Hartford. Their grandchildren live in West Hartford, Wethersfield, Newington, or Glastonbury, or in other states. Their pasta factory is gone. Their churches are gone. Their barber shops are gone. The streets they walked are gone. The plaza that replaced them is, on a quiet weekday evening, still empty. Chapter 9. The Insurance Companies quietly leave. One by one, between 1980 and 2020, the great Hartford insurance companies merged, moved, sold, or quietly drained their headquarters of the people who made the decisions. The departures were rarely announced as such. They were announced as restructurings, as mergers, as strategic realignments, as operational efficiencies. The cumulative effect, however, was unmistakable. By 2024, the insurance industry of Hartford employed less than 37,000 people, down from more than 60,000 in 1990. The capital was still there in the buildings. The decisions were being made elsewhere. The first major departure was Connecticut General. The company had built its Bloomfield campus in 1957, in what was understood at the time as an expansion rather than a relocation. In 1982, Connecticut General merged with the Insurance Company of North America, a Philadelphia firm, to form CIGNA Corporation. CIGNA's corporate headquarters were established in Philadelphia. The Bloomfield campus continued to operate as a major regional center, but the senior decision-making moved south. Over the following 2 decades, CIGNA gradually reduced its Bloomfield headcount as it consolidated administrative functions in Philadelphia, in Tennessee, and elsewhere. The Travelers companies followed. The Travelers, which had occupied its limestone tower at 700 Main Street since 1919, was acquired in 1993 by the Primerica Corporation, a financial services holding company based in Atlanta and run by Sanford Weill. Primerica was promptly renamed the Travelers, Inc. In 1998, Weill merged Travelers, Inc. with Citicorp to form Citigroup, then the largest financial services company in the world. The Hartford operations of Travelers became one division of one subsidiary of one corner of Citigroup. Most of the senior management migrated to New York or to other Citigroup offices. The Travelers Tower remained, but the company decisions were no longer being made inside it. In 1996, the Aetna sold its property and casualty business to the Travelers division of Citigroup for $4 billion. Aetna retained its life and health insurance lines and refocused on managed health care. The combined property and casualty business was rebranded as Travelers Property Casualty. In 2004, Citigroup spun the unit off as a standalone public company, which moved its headquarters to New York while retaining substantial Hartford operations. In 2004, the spin-off merged with the St. Paul companies to form St. Paul Travelers, and in 2007, the name was changed back to Travelers. The corporate center of gravity continued to drift away from Hartford. The Aetna itself, having sold off its property casualty operations, focused on health insurance and grew rapidly during the 1990s and early 2000s. It remained headquartered on Farmington Avenue. In 2017, Aetna announced that it would move its corporate headquarters from Hartford to New York City. The announcement explained that Aetna would build new offices on the west side of Manhattan, that the senior executives would be based there, and that the company expected this would help it attract the best talent in technology, marketing, and finance. The state of New York provided $24 million in tax credits to support the move, and New York City provided up to $10 million in additional incentives. Aetna spent $89 million upgrading a building on 9th Avenue into its new headquarters. The announcement caused a public reaction in Hartford. Aetna had been on Farmington Avenue since 1931. The Colonial Revival Building was the largest concentration of insurance employment in the city. The company's departure was treated by Hartford newspapers as a kind of bereavement. Then, in late 2017, the situation changed again. Aetna agreed to be acquired by CVS Health Corporation, the Rhode Island-based pharmacy chain. The acquisition was completed in 2018 for $69 billion. CVS, headquartered in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, did not need the Manhattan office. The planned move was canceled. Aetna's corporate decisions began to move to Rhode Island instead. The Farmington Avenue building remained occupied, but increasingly by support staff, by call center operations, by administrative functions that did not need to be in Hartford and were not, in any meaningful sense, the headquarters of the company. The Hartford Financial Services Group, the descendant of the original Hartford Fire Insurance Company of 1810, was the surviving major insurance company actually still headquartered in Hartford. It had been spun off from ITT Corporation in 1995 and had grown into a major property casualty insurer. It remained on Asylum Avenue, but its workforce shrank steadily through the 2010s and 20s as it outsourced more functions to lower-cost regional offices and to overseas centers. The Phoenix Companies, the descendant of Phoenix Mutual, was acquired by the Nassau Reinsurance Group in 2016 and effectively absorbed into a larger structure. The Connecticut Mutual Life Insurance Company had been demutualized and acquired by Massachusetts Mutual in 1996. The Hartford Steam Boiler Inspection and Insurance Company was acquired by American International Group in 2000. AIG was bailed out by the federal government in 2008. The Hartford Steam Boiler was sold by AIG to Munich Re in 2009. The decisions that had once been made in a small Hartford office on Pearl Street were now being made in Munich, Germany. The insurance employment numbers tracked the corporate departures. Total insurance employment in the Hartford metropolitan area, including all support staff at all firms, peaked at more than 60,000 in 1990. By 2000, it had fallen to about 50,000. By 2010, it had fallen to about 42,000. By 2020, it had fallen to about 37,000. By 2024, despite a brief recovery during the immediate post-pandemic period, the figure was hovering at roughly the same level. These numbers understate the loss. The jobs that left were not distributed randomly. They were concentrated at the senior end. The actuaries who had set rates from Hartford offices for half a century were moving to Atlanta. The senior underwriters who had decided what risks the companies would accept were moving to Phoenix. The marketing executives who had decided what products the companies would sell were moving to Manhattan. The lawyers who had drafted the policies were moving to New York. The technology officers who had built the data centers were moving to Texas. What remained in Hartford were the back office functions, the call centers, the claims processing units, the administrative support, the lower-paid clerical work that depended on a local labor pool that was cheaper than the equivalent in larger cities. The buildings remained too. The Travelers Tower still rose above Main Street, the Aetna building still anchored Farmington Avenue, the CIGNA campus still sprawled across Bloomfield, the Connecticut Mutual building still stood at Pearl Street, the Phoenix Mutual boat hull still floated next to Constitution Plaza. But the people who occupied the buildings were no longer the people who decided what the companies would do. The pattern was not unique to Hartford. It was, in fact, the standard story of American corporate America in the late 20th century. National companies that had been founded in mid-sized cities consolidated, merged, restructured, and moved their decision-making to a small number of larger centers. Atlanta, Charlotte, Dallas, Houston, Phoenix, and New York gained. Cleveland, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Bridgeport, Buffalo, Rochester, Pittsburgh, and Hartford lost. The wealth did not disappear. It moved. The buildings remained, gradually drained of their original occupants. What ended in Hartford was not the insurance industry as such. The insurance industry survived. It is, by some measures, larger today than it was in 1960. What ended was Hartford as the place where the decisions of the American insurance industry were made. That role had passed almost imperceptibly to other cities. The Blue Onion Dome of the Colt Armory had outlived its factory. The Colonial Dome of Aetna had outlived its boardroom. The limestone shaft of Travelers Tower had outlived its corporate center. The buildings were still standing. The wealth was somewhere else. Chapter 10. Mark Twain's house survives. In the autumn of 1929, with the stock market falling and Hartford preparing for a decade of contraction, a grandniece of Harriet Beecher Stowe refused to let Mark Twain's house be torn down. Her name was Katharine Seymour Day. She was 69 years old. She had grown up next door to the Clemens family. She had played with Twain's daughters in the polychrome brick house at the corner of Farmington Avenue and Forest Street in the 1880s. She had watched the family close the house in 1891 and move to Europe. She had watched Susie Clemens die in the house in 1896. She had watched the house sit empty, then be sold off, then be used variously as a private school, a coal merchant's office, and a series of cheap apartments through the first decades of the 20th century. By 1929, the house was scheduled for demolition. The Twain House in 1929 was not a beautiful object. The grounds had been subdivided and sold off, reducing the original lot to a small parcel. The carriage house had been demolished. The polychrome brick had been painted over in cheap brown. The interior had been broken up into smaller apartments. The Tiffany decorations had been covered with paint and wallpaper. The third-floor billiard room, where Twain had written Huckleberry Finn, had been converted into a small kitchen. The house was, from the outside, almost unrecognizable. Katharine Day began her campaign in the spring of 1929, when she heard that a developer had bought the property and intended to demolish the house and build a small apartment block in its place. She founded an organization she called the Friends of Hartford and began raising money. She visited the city's surviving insurance presidents. She wrote to the editors of the Hartford Courant. She walked the Hartford Club at lunchtime and approached anyone who would listen. She raised, in the course of a 2-year campaign, the sum of $100,000, with which she secured a mortgage on the property and bought it from the developer. That she succeeded at all in the worst opening years of the Great Depression, in a Hartford that was already losing population and losing wealth, is something close to miraculous. The other Nook Farm houses did not survive. The Charles Dudley Warner House had been demolished in the 1920s. The Isabella Beecher Hooker House had been demolished. The original Joseph Twitchell House had been demolished. The Harriet Beecher Stowe house next door survived only because Day's mother, Alice Day, had already preserved it as a small museum in 1924. The Twain House was the last great Nook farmhouse standing, and Katharine Day saved it almost single-handed. The house she saved was not yet a museum. Through the 1930s, it was operated as a public library branch, in a partial restoration that left the apartments above the main floor intact. Through the 1940s and 50s, it operated variously as a school, a community center, and a temporary museum during summer months. The serious restoration began in the early 1960s, when a new generation of supporters, led by the architectural historian Wilson H. Faude, began the long work of stripping out the apartment partitions, removing the paint from the brick and the wallpaper from the Tiffany decorations, and bringing the house back to its 1881 configuration. The restoration was completed in 1974. The Mark Twain House opened to the public as a museum in that year. What visitors see today is, by every measure of historical accuracy, the house Mark Twain inhabited. The polychrome brick has been restored on the exterior. The Tiffany interiors are intact. The carved oak entrance hall, the silver stenciled drawing room, the mahogany library, the stained glass on the staircase landing, all survive. Twain's third-floor billiard room has been restored as his study, with a long desk under the window looking south. The house is on the National Register of Historic Places. It is a National Historic Landmark. It is operated by the Mark Twain House and Museum, an independent nonprofit organization. It draws roughly 75,000 visitors a year from across the country and the world. The neighboring museum building, designed by Robert A. M. Stern in 1999, holds exhibitions, lecture spaces, and a research library. The house Katharine Day saved is, by some margin, the single most important act of historic preservation Hartford has carried out. It is also the single clearest illustration of how the city's losses became its inheritance. The wealth that built the Twain House was gone by 1929. The literary community that surrounded it was gone. The Nook Farm neighborhood was gone. The Clemens family was gone. The house remained, and one person who had grown up next to it refused to let it go. This is the deeper pattern. Almost every important building in Hartford that survives today survives because someone, at some particular moment, refused to let it be demolished. Armsmear survives because Elizabeth Colt wrote her will to convert the estate to a home for clergy widows. The Colt Armory survives because Elizabeth Colt rebuilt it in steel and brick after the fire of 1864. The Aetna building survives because the colonial revival shell was too vast and too well built to demolish economically. The Travelers Tower survives because travelers retained it after the Citigroup acquisition. The G. Fox building survives because the state of Connecticut bought it for community college use after May closed the retail operation. The Wadsworth Athenaeum survives because it is endowed. The Connecticut State Capitol survives because it is the seat of state government. The Bushnell survives because it was funded by a private bequest. The buildings that did not survive are largely the ones that no one fought for. The Front Street neighborhood was demolished. The Sage Allen building was demolished. The Brown-Thompson building was demolished. The Cheney Brothers Hartford Ribbon Mill on Morgan Street was demolished. Most of the worker housing of Coltsville south of the East Armory was demolished. The Pope Manufacturing Company buildings were demolished. The Royal Typewriter Company buildings were demolished. The Allen House Hotel was demolished. The United States Hotel was demolished. The Heublein Hotel was demolished. The Cheney Block had its grand cornice stripped off and its facade simplified. Katharine Day's gift to Hartford was not just the Twain House. It was the principle that a small city could preserve its most important buildings if a small number of its residents cared enough to fight for them. That principle has shaped the survival of every major historic building in the city since 1929. Chapter 11. The city cannot pay its bills. By the early 21st century, almost half the land inside the boundaries of Hartford was owned by institutions that did not pay a dollar of property tax. The state capitol complex was tax-exempt. The federal courthouse was tax-exempt. Trinity College was tax-exempt. St. Francis Hospital was tax-exempt. Hartford Hospital was tax-exempt. The Wadsworth Athenaeum was tax-exempt. The Mark Twain House was tax-exempt. The Bushnell was tax-exempt. The Connecticut Historical Society was tax-exempt. The various churches and cemeteries were tax-exempt. By the most commonly cited estimate, more than 40% of the assessed value of property inside the city limits was held by institutions that did not contribute to the municipal tax base. The other 60% had to carry the city. The arithmetic was not favorable. The remaining commercial property had to be taxed at the highest rates in the Northeast simply to balance the municipal budget. Hartford's commercial property tax rate by the early 2000s was the highest of any state capital in the country. The high rate, in turn, discouraged commercial tenants from locating in the city. Office buildings that had been built for the insurance industry of the 1920s were now competing with suburban office parks in Bloomfield, in East Hartford, in Glastonbury, in Farmington, in West Hartford, all of which charge property tax at half or less of the Hartford rate. The remaining tenants demanded long-term tax abatements as a condition of staying. The abatements further eroded the tax base. The residential side was no better. Hartford's residential property tax rate by the early 2000s was also among the highest in the state. The high residential rate further accelerated the white flight that had been underway since the 1950s. Families that could afford to move did so. Families that could not stayed. The city's median household income fell year by year relative to the surrounding suburbs. By the middle 2010s, the city was running structural budget deficits and meeting them by drawing on its rapidly diminishing reserves. The pension obligations to retired municipal workers, accumulated over decades, were growing faster than the tax revenue available to pay them. The city's bond rating was downgraded multiple times. By 2017, Hartford was at serious risk of municipal bankruptcy. In the autumn of 2017, the state of Connecticut intervened. Under a debt restructuring deal negotiated with the legislature, the state assumed responsibility for more than $500 million of Hartford's outstanding bond debt. In return, the city accepted state oversight of its budgets through an entity called the Municipal Accountability Review Board. The deal averted formal bankruptcy. It also confirmed, in writing, what had been true in practice for some years. Hartford was no longer financially independent. It was a ward of the state. The other measure of the city's condition is its poverty rate. As of recent census data, more than 22.7% of Hartford families live below the federal poverty line. The median household income is roughly $46,411, well below the Connecticut state median of $80,000 and roughly half the median income of West Hartford or Glastonbury. 87% of Hartford residents are people of color. The city's child poverty rate is among the highest in New England. The city's life expectancy is roughly 5 years lower than the state average. The contrast with the buildings is the heart of the story. The Aetna building, the colonial fortress on Farmington Avenue, still stands. The colonial revival shell is still the largest building of its kind in the world. Inside, the building is, by the early 2020s, largely empty. The senior decision-making that once filled it has moved to Rhode Island. Most of the upper floors are sublet or vacant. The marble lobby is mostly empty during the day. The post office, the print shop, the cafeteria, the barber shop, the infirmary, all the elements of the self-contained office city designed by James Gamble Rogers in 1929 have been gradually closed over the past 30 years. The building is a shell of the corporation that built it. The Travelers Tower is similarly underused. The 24th floor, which housed the executive offices for more than half a century, is now used for occasional meetings. The private dining club on the 23rd floor has been closed. The observation deck on the 27th floor is open by appointment for small groups, not as a public tourist attraction. The tower is still occupied by Travelers' operational staff, but the building is no longer the corporate center that it was for most of the 20th century. The G. Fox building, as already described, is occupied by Capital Community College on its upper floors and is largely vacant on its retail floors. The Phoenix Mutual boat hull on Constitution Plaza is occupied by Nassau Re, the company that absorbed Phoenix Mutual in 2016. The Constitution Plaza office buildings carry vacancy rates well above the regional average. The downtown office vacancy rate reached more than 30% in 2023. As remote work after the pandemic emptied even the buildings that still had nominal tenants. This is the present-day Hartford, a city of 121,000, a city with more than 22% of its families in poverty, a city carrying 19th century infrastructure on 21st century revenues, a city whose great monuments are largely empty, a city that pays its bills with the help of the state because it can no longer pay them on its own. It is also the city where the buildings still stand. Chapter 12. The buildings still stand. Walk along Main Street, up Farmington Avenue, out to Wethersfield Avenue and Asylum Hill, and every monument the richest city in America built for itself is still there. The blue onion dome of the Colt Armory still rises above the South Meadows. The gold dome of the Aetna building still presides over Farmington Avenue. The limestone shaft of the Travelers Tower still stands at the corner of Main and Grove. The polychrome brick of the Mark Twain House still flashes orange and black at the corner of Farmington Avenue and Forest Street. The cream terracotta of the G. Fox building still anchors the block of Main and Talcott. The Italianate mass of Armsmear still sits on its Wethersfield Avenue hillside. The Wadsworth Athenaeum still opens its doors to anyone who walks in. The Connecticut state capitol still raises its gilded dome above Bushnell Park. The Bushnell still holds its concerts. The old State House by Charles Bulfinch still stands at the foot of Main Street. The Cathedral of St. Joseph still rises on Farmington Avenue. The Cheney Block by Henry Hobson Richardson still holds its corner. This is the legacy. A small city in Connecticut still carries one of the densest concentrations of important American architecture of any community of its size in the country. The buildings are the architectural inheritance of a wealth that no longer exists in the place that built them. They were built to last, and they have lasted past the wealth that paid for them by margins of 40, 60, 80, and 100 years. The story they tell, taken together, is not the story of a collapse. It is the story of a migration. The wealth that paid for the buildings did not vanish in a fire or a flood or a war. It moved. The Colt machine tools were shipped to other plants in other states. The Aetna policies were rewritten on computers in Rhode Island offices. The Travelers' Underwriting Authority was migrated to New York and then to a series of regional centers. The Cheney silk operation was sold to a southern textile firm. The G. Fox retail operation was absorbed into a national department store chain and then closed when that chain no longer wanted to carry it. The wealth survived. It is somewhere else. The buildings remain. This is the deeper truth Hartford illustrates about American wealth. Wealth in this country does not generally collapse. It moves. It moves to lower taxes, to cheaper labor, to weaker regulation, to better climates, to friendlier governments. It moves to wherever the next half-century looks more profitable than the last. It moves with the shareholders, who do not care which city carries the headquarters as long as the dividend checks arrive in their mailboxes on time. The buildings that the wealth once filled remain. They cannot move. They were built into the ground. The wealth that built Hartford between 1865 and 1929 was the wealth of insurance, manufacturing, finance, and publishing. Each of those engines moved. The insurance moved to Atlanta, Phoenix, Manhattan, and Rhode Island. The manufacturing moved to North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, and then to Mexico, China, and Vietnam. The finance moved to New York and London. The publishing moved to New York and then to digital platforms based in California. The cities that gained from the migration are larger, newer, and warmer. The cities that lost are smaller, older, and colder. The buildings remain where they were built. What gives Hartford its particular weight as an American story is the quality of what was left behind. Other cities lost more in absolute terms. Detroit lost 500,000 people and 3/4 of its manufacturing. St. Louis lost its industrial base and most of its riverfront. Cleveland lost its steel works. Pittsburgh lost its steel works. Buffalo lost its grain handling. Cincinnati lost its consumer products. Bridgeport and New Haven lost their machine shops. But few of those cities concentrated as much money in as small a footprint, and few left behind buildings of the quality Hartford left. The Colt Armory Dome, the Twain House, the Aetna Fortress, the Travelers Tower, the G. Fox Building, Armsmear, the Wadsworth Athenaeum, the State Capitol, the Bushnell, the Cheney Building, the Old State House, the Cathedral of St. Joseph are, taken together, an architectural inheritance that few small American cities can match. The buildings stand in a city of 121,000 people, more than a fifth of whom live in poverty, in a downtown that empties at 6 in the evening, on streets that have not seen the wealth that built them in 3/4 of a century. The contrast is the visual and emotional center of any honest account of Hartford. The buildings are too good for the city that surrounds them. They were built for a city that had 3 times as much money per resident as anywhere else in America. They are too grand, too solid, too carefully detailed, too generously sited for the smaller, poorer, less confident city that now contains them. They are oversized clothes on a thinner body. This is the truth that Hartford makes harder to avoid than any other American city. Wealth in America is not loyal to place. It will leave the place that made it as soon as it can find a better deal somewhere else. It will leave behind the buildings, the institutions, the infrastructure, the people who depended on it. It will leave them to manage on whatever revenues they can still generate, with whatever institutions they can still maintain. It will not look back. It will rebuild somewhere else with the same confidence and the same self-congratulation. Charles Hopkins Clark sat at his desk at Scribner's Monthly in 1876 and did some arithmetic. The richest city in America, per capita, 40,000 residents, a perfectly engineered prosperity. He believed the arithmetic would hold. He believed Hartford would always be the richest city in America because the conditions that had made it so seemed permanent. He was wrong. The conditions were not permanent. They held for about half a century. Then they began to drift, and then they shifted, and then they were gone. The blue dome of the Colt Armory still rises over the South Meadows. The fiberglass replica is bright enough on a clear day to see from Interstate 91. The Gilded Colt still stands on its sphere at the top. The dome was built to last by a man who never imagined that the city beneath it could not afford to maintain its own streets. The dome is still there. The city beneath it is still trying to find a way forward. This is the lesson Hartford offers. Build for permanence, and someone will tell the story for as long as the buildings stand. But do not assume the wealth that builds the buildings will stay where it was made. It will not.